Snow fell in thick, slanting sheets that erased the far end of the railbed and turned the world into a narrow tunnel of sound. A horn could have been a mile away or 100 yards. The only certainty was the track underfoot and the black lattice of trees beyond the embankment. Near the switch, a temporary signal lamp stood on a short pole beside the line, its glass lens rimmed with ice. It should have been the hard point in the whiteout, the visible gate that told any driver to stop. Tonight, it was dark. Staff Sergeant Owen Harker, military police, had been on this closure since dusk. In the rear area during the Ardennes fighting, traffic discipline was a form of life support. Ambulances, fuel, and food all depended on lanes and schedules that could not afford guesswork. A lamp that failed in a blizzard was not just a mechanical problem, it was a hole in a system that depended on visibility. Harker ran a gloved hand over the lamp housing, feeling ice and the stiff cable leading down toward a battery box half buried in drifted snow. No warmth, no vibration, no flicker. He did not open it. He carried tools, but he left them shut. If he changed the lamp's state without a witness and without an authorization entry, the closure would become an argument instead of a fact. 2 makeshift barricades, a coil of wire, and reflective panels fixed to stakes marked the closed segment. Their surfaces were already dulling under ice. Private Diaz, posted at the near barricade, shifted his stance as Harker approached, rifle angled down but ready. A field telephone line ran along poles toward a small siding where a shack held a handset connected to the rear area movement desk. Harker could not see the road network or the nearest rail junction. He had to assume movement existed and act as if it could arrive at any minute. He checked his watch and then the notebook in his pocket. The shift change window was still hours away, but the turnover sheet felt heavy all the same. His relief would want clean entries, not gaps. Gaps were where blame lived. Bootsteps sounded behind him, fast for the conditions, and 2 MPs guided a man into the pale spill of a hooded flashlight. The detainee was not bound, but his wrists were held close by the escorts. He wore a German field jacket, patched and stained, and no helmet. His hair was dark and matted with melted snow. He was slight, older than the average infantryman, with the knotted hands of someone used to wire and tools. He had been taken from a farmhouse inside the tightened area. Not an officer, not a combat leader, someone with the look of a line worker caught in the wrong place. The holding procedure required documentation first: name, property, custody, start time, restrictions. The man lifted his chin, eyes fixed not on the MPs but on the lamp. He began to speak rapidly, words broken by accent and cold. One escort cut him off with a palm-out gesture and a firm English command to be quiet. The man flinched, then tried again, slower, pointing with his chin toward the battery box. Harker listened long enough to understand the offer. The detainee was claiming he could fix the lamp. Harker did not need fluent English to read the urgency in the forward, lean, and open hands. The tired part of Harker wanted the solution that restored visibility. The trained part of him heard the questions that would follow. Why did he allow an unauthorized person near the closure device? Why did he accept an unverified repair? Why did he risk a false signal on a line used by medical and supply traffic? Harker asked for the man's name. The escort gave it from memory, clipped and uncertain. The detainee corrected it with 2 hard syllables, something closer to Matthews. Harker wrote the sound as best he could and added a custody start time. He asked what had been found on him: a small tool pouch, wire cutters, a field telephone spool. No weapon. The tool pouch had been confiscated and tagged. Harker asked for the tag number and wrote it into the log. Mathis tried again, more controlled. He held his hands open, palms up, and mimed a twisting motion as if turning a latch. He pointed toward the pole line where the cable ran, traced a short path in the snow with his boot, then tapped the battery box with his toe. The gestures were careful, almost pleading, and the care made Harker more cautious. Harker did not debate technical merit. He looked past Mathis to the barricades and reflective panels. Those were his immediate options. A failed lamp did not mean an open rail. It meant a stronger closure. He widened his stance so his body became part of the barrier between the detainee and the pole, then pulled a red cloth marker from his pack and tied it high on a stake near the dead lens, where even a weak headlamp could catch it. Diaz watched the movement and waited. Harker pointed to the near barricade. Diaz moved it 10 yards forward and angled it across the track bed, forcing any authorized approach to slow and funnel. The change improved visibility, but it also increased friction for anyone who might later claim the closure was unclear. Corporal Leary returned from the far edge with snow crusted on his coat and eyelashes. Harker asked for the paperwork packet. Leary pulled it from inside his coat, the current closure order, the running password for the segment, and the last signed turnover sheet. Harker flipped the turnover sheet open and found a blank space where a routine lamp check should have been initialed. The omission changed the night. If a vehicle later claimed it had not seen a closure, the paper would not be able to contradict it. Harker tapped the blank with a gloved finger. Leary's eyes tightened. He understood without comment. Harker sent Leary to the siding shack. The order was narrow. Raise the movement desk by field phone. Request an authorized replacement signal or an approved alternate method, and bring back any spare lantern or battery from the locker if one existed. Leary left at a stubborn trot. Harker watched him go until the snow swallowed his flashlight. Mathis tracked Leary with his eyes and then stepped forward, a half step that carried his boots toward the pole. The escorts tightened their grip. One raised his rifle slightly, not to threaten, but to signal boundary. The motion was enough to make Mathis stop. Harker spoke slowly, using words that carried no negotiation. No one touched the lamp without authorization. The area was closed. The closure would be made visible by other means until the right equipment and the right signatures were present. Mathis's face twitched with frustration. He jabbed a finger toward the pole line and then pressed a hand to his own chest as if to claim responsibility. The certainty in the gesture was a risk. In this moment he was a detainee under temporary hold, and the line between rolls was the same line the dead lamp was supposed to show. Harker opened his logbook and wrote an entry meant to survive a review. Temporary signal lamp at closure point inoperative. Alternative markers deployed. Closure advanced. Detainee offered repair assistance. Repair denied pending authorization. Witness and alternate signal presence. He added the time in heavy numerals and closed the book. Harker walked the closure boundary, testing each stake with a gloved pull. One stake loosened in the drift. He reset it, tamping snow hard around the base with his boot. He checked the red cloth marker from the track approach and added a second strip lower near the ballast, where a headlamp might catch it if the upper strip froze flat. When he returned, Mathis was still there, held between the escorts, eyes fixed on the dead lamp. The detainee's breath came in quick clouds. Harker took the custody card and wrote a supplemental line. Detainee to remain isolated from rail equipment, no tools, hands visible when moved, escorted at all times. Snow piled on the lamp's lens. In the flashlight beam, it looked like a covered eye. Harker held position beside it, a man standing guard over an absence. If Leary returned with a spare lantern or a battery, the next step would still not be to hand Mathis a latch. The next step would be to obtain a signature, stamp the time, set an alternate signal in sight, and make sure another pair of eyes witnessed every action. In the Ardennes, speed without proof was not speed. It was the first step toward an accident. Snow thickened after midnight into a steady, granular hiss that scoured cloth and leather. The red strips Harker had tied to the stakes stiffened into hard flags. The storm lantern he had mounted near the dead signal lamp gave a weak amber pool that barely pushed back the whiteout, but it was something a cautious driver could read. Leary returned from the siding shack with ice on his eyebrows and a folded message slip protected inside his coat. The rear area movement desk had answered the field phone and issued a repeat directive. No unscheduled rail movement on this segment, priority for medical evacuation and fuel, and no deviation from marked closures without written authorization. A replacement lamp and battery could be pushed forward, but no one promised a time. The weather was fouling the roads and radio traffic. Leary had also carried back what he could find in the shack. A second lantern and a half-empty can of matches. The second lantern's glass was chipped, and its wick was damp. Harker set it aside. One working flame was better than two unreliable ones. He took the message slip, read it twice, and copied its substance into his notebook with the time and the source. The entry did not make the lamp work. It made the closure defensible. Mathis watched the writing with a hunger that had nothing to do with ink. He began speaking again, quieter and more deliberate. He pointed from the lantern to the dead lamp, then traced the cable line with a stiff finger, and then made a flat-palmed motion down the track as if describing an approach. He held up two fingers and tapped his wrist, then spread his hands wide as if to show impact. The escorts tightened their stance, reading agitation. Harker did not treat the gestures as a negotiation. He treated them as a report from an interested party. Mathis appeared to be warning that movement might still happen, authorized or not, and that a dark lens could be mistaken for open track in this visibility. Harker did not accept the claim as verified. He did not dismiss it. He wrote a short note in a separate section of the log. Detainee reports risk of approach, visibility compromised, closure markers reinforced. Mathis' next request was unmistakable. He mimed opening a latch, then pointed toward the sealed property tag on his tool pouch. He pressed his fingers together as if holding pliers, then pointed at the battery box buried in drifted snow. His eyes said the rest. Give him the tools, give him a minute, and he would restore the lamp. The request sharpened the night's problem into a single fork. A working lamp would reduce collision risk and improve control. It would also create a different risk, an unauthorized detainee touching rail equipment with no supervising technical authority and a turnover sheet already missing an initial where a routine check should have been. In a rear area under stress, an accident did not need malice. It needed only ambiguity and a later argument about who had the right to act. Harker answered with procedure, not persuasion. He ordered Leary to bring the detainee property log to the lantern light. The pouch remained sealed. Harker wrote an explicit restriction on the custody card. No access to tools, no contact with rail equipment, escorted movement only, hands visible during transport. He then chose the conservative path that did not rely on trust or skill. He widened the closure. Diaz and the other MP dragged the second barricade down the line to where the track dipped into a shallow cut and visibility narrowed further. They drove stakes at angles and ran wire between them, low and tight, so that any headlamp beam would catch it. Harker repositioned the lantern to mark the near side and retied the red cloth strips so their edges would flutter instead of freezing flat. The closure became slower to cross and harder to misread. It also became more labor to maintain, and the added labor would matter if relief arrived exhausted and short-handed. Mathis watched the work and hardened as if the barrier were being built around his throat. He spoke again, the words clipped by fatigue and fear. One word came through clearly, repeated with urgency. Shoot! He shook his head hard, then pointed at the dead lamp and made a snapping motion, like a switch being thrown. Harker heard the misinterpretation forming. A detainee who believed the process was a prelude to violence would try to seize control of the one object that seemed to decide the outcome. That object was the lamp. In this storm, it was also the most fragile boundary in the whole segment. A gust shifted the snow along the ballast and exposed a length of field telephone wire that had been partially pulled free. It might have been wind, it might have been earlier movement. Either way, it was a failure point. Mathis saw it and reacted with the reflex of a man trained to protect lines. He lunged one step toward it, hands already lowering as if to grab and tuck it back. The escort stopped him before intent could become action. An arm locked across his chest, another hand seized his sleeve, and their rifles lifted just enough to claim space without threatening to fire. Mathis froze, breath harsh, eyes wide. He tried to speak, then swallowed the words and lifted his hands, fingers spread, showing empty palms. In the distance a pale light appeared and vanished through the snow, a single pulse that could have been a patrol lantern or a vehicle turning on a road. It was enough to make the closure feel suddenly thin. Harker used the moment to drive controlled checks. He sent Diaz to inspect the field phone line for damage and confirm the handset still had tone. He sent Leary back to the shack to rerun the password check with the movement desk and ask again about any authorized relief or replacement en route. Both orders moved risk away from improvisation and toward verification. Mathis tracked the tempo and misread it as escalation toward harm. He spoke again, faster, pointing at the cable, then at the lamp, then at Harker's notebook, as if insisting that writing could not stop what was coming. The escorts tightened their grip. Harker stepped in front of Mathis, narrowing the detainee's focus away from the equipment. He signaled for increased control distance and moved Mathis back 2 paces from the exposed wire. Harker then did the one thing that changed the structure of the night without changing the weather. He opened the turnover sheet under the lantern and held it where Diaz and Leary could see the blank space. He did not backfill it and did not invent an earlier inspection. He wrote a corrective entry that stated what had happened since his arrival. The temporary signal lamp found inoperative at a specific time. Alternate markers deployed, closure advanced, secondary barricade emplaced, movement desk contacted, replacement requested, detainee offered repair and was denied pending written authorization. Custody restrictions increased after an unauthorized approach attempt. He added the time, then had Diaz initial as witness to the entry. Mathis stared at the paper as if it were a wall being built in front of him. The fear in his face did not vanish, but it shifted. The missing ink had been his proof that anything could happen. New ink, witnessed and timed, suggested a different kind of reality, one where actions left tracks that could be followed. Leary returned again with a fresh message from the movement desk. The clarification was blunt. No detainee labor on rail equipment, regardless of supervision, unless a designated rail control officer authorized it in writing. They cited sabotage, risk, and liability in the same breath. Harker copied the clarification into the log and closed the notebook. The ruling settled the immediate question. The lamp would stay dark until authorized equipment arrived. Harker adjusted the lantern chimney and shielded the flame with his body until it steadied again. He checked the wire line and had Diaz retuck the exposed section deeper into the snow without cutting or splicing, then wrote that action down as a protective measure. Each small move was a response to the same standard. If something approached in the whiteout, the closure would be unmistakable. If someone later asked why the closure had been held and why no one had touched the lamp, the record would answer. Mathis stood quieter now, shoulders sagging under the weight of the widened barricades and the sealed tag on his tools. He still watched the dead lamp, but no longer as a lever he could grab. He watched it as the center of a system that had decided in writing what he could not do. The snow kept falling. The closure held. Snow kept falling, but the flakes had lost their earlier bulk. They came like dry grit now, stinging faces and polishing every edge into a crust. That change did not make the segment safer. It made it deceitful. A driver could catch a quick glimpse of rail bed and mistake it for clearance, then lose the markers again when the next curtain of snow slid sideways. Harker treated the shift change window as a deadline with weight. He checked his watch and wrote the time, then walked the closure from the lantern by the dead lamp to the wire and stakes Diaz had set farther down. The expanded barrier looked solid in his flashlight beam, but it depended on constant attention. Cloth flags froze into stiff blades. Stakes loosened as drifting powder softened their bases. Wire sagged when ice collected on it. Diaz reported that the field telephone still had tone and that the handset in the siding shack reached the movement desk without delay. Harker recorded the check and initialed the entry. Leary returned with the latest message slip, the paper already limp from humidity under his coat. The movement desk had pushed the situation up to a rail control officer. The answer came back with detail that could survive scrutiny. No replacement lamp would be delivered before daylight. No on-site repair would be authorized under current conditions. The closure would be expanded to the next siding. Alternate signals would be maintained with lanterns and reflective barriers. All actions were to be documented with time stamps and witness initials. Harker copied each element into his notebook, including the officer's name, rank, and the time of issue. He then read the directive aloud to Diaz and Leary in an even voice that carried through the storm. The act was not theater. It aligned their understanding of what could not be done. The dead lamp would remain dark. Improvisation would not be used to make it bright. Speed would be purchased only with additional barrier work and additional record. He reorganized positions. Diaz moved out first with a lantern, stakes, and wire, trudging toward the turnout where the line bent behind a low rise. Leary took the chipped lantern as reserve and placed himself at a midpoint where a faint curve could hide an approach. Harker stayed near the dead signal lamp because it was the legal reference point in the closure order and because his log would be inspected against it. Mathis watched the redeployment with the stiff concentration of someone who had spent years judging systems by the way they were maintained. He had stopped trying to claim the lamp with his hands, but his eyes still returned to it as if it were a verdict. The blanket around his shoulders did not stop the tremor in his jaw. His posture stayed forward, as if leaning could shorten the night and as if the lamp's silence was still speaking about him. Harker noticed how Mathis tracked the writing. Each time Harker opened the notebook, Mathis's gaze sharpened. Each time Harker shut it, Mathis's shoulders tightened again. The detainee did not trust the men, and trust was not the currency being offered. He was beginning to measure the paper, the time stamps, the witness initials, and the way those marks changed what the MPs allowed themselves to do. A gust blew loose snow off the ballast, and exposed a length of field telephone wire Diaz had tucked earlier. It lifted and settled like a living thing. Mathis's hands twitched toward it, then stopped. The earlier restraint by the escorts had taught him the boundary. Instead of lunging, he made a small pinching motion with his fingers, a warning in miniature, and looked to Harker rather than the wire. That change mattered. It gave Harker a choice other than force. Harker ordered the escorts to widen their spacing, not to loosen custody, but to reduce the sense of a closing net. He signaled for Mathis to keep his hands visible and to remain seated while the working space was cleared. Mathis complied, curling his fingers into the blanket and turning his face slightly away from the track. Diaz returned from the turnout with a report that the stakes would not hold in drifted powder without reinforcement. The snow had filled the shallow cut and hidden the base of the embankment. Harker did not treat the problem as a reason to abandon the extension. He treated it as a resource constraint. He sent Leary back to the shack for a pick, a length of lumber, and any spare reflective panels, even if they were meant for road work. Leary came back with a short plank, a crate slat, and 2 scuffed panels. Harker and Diaz drove the plank down as a brace and lashed the stake line to it with wire. They hung the reflective panels at angles where a headlamp would catch them before it could reach the lantern glow. Harker placed lanterns so their weak pools of amber made the wire line readable from multiple approaches. Each time he moved a marker, he wrote the action, the reason, and the time. Each time he wrote, he required a second set of initials, turning the barrier from a personal decision into a documented constraint that would outlast any one man's memory. The work slowed the night. It also made the closure heavier and more expensive to violate. The system was choosing certainty over speed, and that choice forced every person on the segment into a narrower set of lawful actions. Mathis watched the narrowing and finally understood what it was for. In the whiteout, the dead signal lamp becomes the only honest witness left on the line. The thought did not comfort him, but it redirected him. The lamp had stopped being a threat that predicted violence. It had become proof that a boundary existed even when the storm tried to erase it. When Harker signaled for the escorts to move Mathis 10 yards farther from the track to clear the working space, Mathis stood without resistance. He held his hands where they could be seen and stepped back, eyes down, as if acknowledging that any approach would be read first as a procedural breach and only later as an explanation. Leary reported that the movement desk had confirmed the running password and repeated the instruction to maintain the expanded closure until daylight. Harker wrote the confirmation and had Leary initial as witness. He then opened the turnover sheet and added a clean summary line that tied every action to the directive. Alternate signals deployed. Closure advanced to the next siding. No authorized repair attempted. Detainee kept isolated from equipment. Field phone line checked for continuity. Reflective markers and lantern positions established at approach, midpoint, and turnout. Witness initials obtained for each change. The entries did not warm anyone. They reduced argument, and argument was its own hazard in a rear area under strain. As the sky began to pale, the snow took on a gray sheen. Visibility improved by inches rather than yards, but those inches were enough to tempt movement. Harker walked the approach again and judged how the markers would read to a tired driver with a narrow beam. He added one more cloth strip to the nearest panel and retied a frozen flag so it fluttered instead of lying flat. He recorded the adjustment and stepped back to view the closure as an approaching vehicle would see it. The barrier now spoke with redundancy. Wire, reflective angles, lantern glow, and a closure advanced far enough that a mistaken approach would meet friction long before speed. Mathis sat on the crate near the embankment, blanket tight around him. He looked exhausted, but his breathing had slowed. When Harker checked on him, Mathis gave a single nod and then glanced at the notebook. The gesture was not gratitude. It was recognition that the notebook was the mechanism keeping choices from turning into violence, and that the men guarding him were using that mechanism on themselves. Relief arrived as a dim shape in first light boots crunching on ice. The incoming sergeant listened while Harker walked him through the closure and the expanded boundary. Harker showed him the directive copy, the timestamps, and the witness initials. He pointed out the midpoint lantern and the turnout markers and described the detainee restrictions, including the earlier approach attempt and the isolation rule that followed. The sergeant asked whether anyone had repaired the signal lamp. Harker answered no and placed a finger on the entry that made the answer durable. When Harker finally stepped back from the line, the dead lamp stood half buried, its lens packed with snow and ice. It had not been restored. It had still held its place at the center of a night that refused shortcuts. The expanded closure remained in effect, and the morning would reroute around it. Mathis would be transferred with paperwork that documented restraint and procedure instead of panic. The segment ended with a boundary that stayed visible and a record that could be followed. Daylight did not arrive like a switch. It seeped into the storm as a thin gray wash that revealed shapes without warmth. The closure looked different in morning light, not smaller, but more obvious. Wire lines that had been invisible at night now cut clear arcs across the approach. Reflective panels dulled by ice still caught any stray beam. The lanterns remained lit, their flames reduced to backup rather than primary signal. The incoming sergeant held Harker's notebook close to the lantern glow and read the entries with the steady impatience of a man stepping into responsibility. He asked for the directive source again and compared the timestamps to his own watch. Harker answered each question with the same economy he had used all night. The closure had been expanded per instruction. No repair had been authorized. The detainee had been held under restrictions designed to keep him away from rail equipment and to keep the MPs away from improvisation. Once the relief sergeant accepted custody of the segment, the closure became his problem. That mattered more than rest. Harker watched him assign Diaz to the near approach and Leary to the midpoint, keeping the same pattern to preserve continuity. The new assignments were recorded, signed, and acknowledged. The line did not loosen because one man stepped away. It held because the next man stepped into a documented structure. Mathis stood a short distance from the track with the borrowed blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. In daylight, the fatigue in his face was clearer. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes rimmed red from wind, and his hands shook when he moved them out of the blanket. He did not speak. The night had taught him that speaking did not change permissions. It changed only how quickly a boundary was enforced. A transport detail arrived from the rear with a half-track and a clerk. They carried forms and a canvas satchel for property tags. The clerk asked Harker for the custody card, the property tag numbers, and the time of initial detention. Harker provided them, then pointed out the supplemental restriction entries: no access to tools, no contact with rail equipment, escorted movement only, hands visible during transport. The clerk copied the restrictions with a careful hand. Those words would travel with Mathis longer than the storm. The relief sergeant asked whether the tool pouch should remain sealed. Harker answered that it would remain sealed until a designated officer signed for its release. The clerk noted it. Nothing about the exchange carried anger. It carried procedure. Each item moved through hands only when the record allowed it. Mathis watched the clerk's pen and then the pouch itself, still tagged and tied shut. He made a small motion as if to explain again. then stopped. The compulsion to prove his usefulness was still there, but it had changed shape. He understood now that usefulness without authorization was not help. It was a liability that could pull everyone into the same hole. Harker did not offer comfort. He offered a final clarity that matched the structure Mathis had finally recognized. Harker indicated the expanded barrier line and then the notebook showing how the closure existed in both wire and ink. He showed the directive that had denied repair and the entry that had recorded the denial. He made clear by gesture and tone that the lack of a repair had not been a punishment. It had been a refusal to gamble with an invisible approach and an untraceable action. Mathis nodded once, slower than before. The nod was an acceptance of limits rather than agreement. He stepped toward the half-track only when the escort signaled him, and he kept his hands visible without being told. Before leaving, Harker walked one last inspection of the closure with the relief sergeant. They checked the midpoint lantern, the turnout stakes, and the wire line braced with the plank. They tested the reflective panels by angling a flashlight beam across them. Each check ended with a short note and an initial. The morning routine began immediately, not as a break from the night, but as its continuation in better light. The dead signal lamp remained dark. It would likely be replaced later when weather and transport allowed. Until then, the closure did not depend on it. The closure depended on redundancy, multiple markers, multiple positions, and a record chain that made every choice visible to people who were not present. Harker left the segment with his gloves stiff from ice and his shoulders sore from tension held too long. The storm behind him continued over the Ardennes, indifferent to rules or men. Yet the small section of rail he had guarded through the night stayed closed without a collision, stayed closed without a shot, and stayed closed without anyone crossing a line that could not be defended afterward. Mathis rode away in the half-track, wrapped in the same blanket, bound more by paperwork than by force. He had entered the closure believing that delay meant violence. He left it understanding that delay could also mean restraint, and that restraint had a shape: wire in the snow, lantern glow, initials on a page, and a dead lamp that no one was allowed to touch.